see fit to suppress our reproductive cycle. Sincerely, a concerned citizen. Thank you for writing, concern. Of course, your question touches on one of the basic biological impulses.
I want to let you guys in on a little known secret about myself. I love when games have good physics. It's not something a lot of people care about, but it matters to me, so I want to talk about it. Greetings everyone, I hope that your day or night is going good, because today we're talking about physics in video games. We're going to be looking at some of the best and worst examples, why some games need it and others don't. Get comfortable, grab yourself a snack or a soda, and let's get into it. Any clips that aren't mine will have a source in the bottom left and a link in the description. So to be clear, a lot of this video is going to be subjective. I think that's okay though, because as a member of the gamer army, I know what it feels like to spend probably too much money on these games and devote a little bit too much time to them. What we like and don't like matters, and if we're going to be devoting so much of ourselves to these games, I think preference is pretty important. Before we start getting into the nitty-gritty though, I do want to try and define what exactly I mean when I say physics. In real life you might think about stuff like velocity, gravity, acceleration. I'm not a scientist. A lot of the definitions all of them in this video are a lot more simple and really just oriented around what looks cool when it blows up. I've separated the different kinds of physics into three definitive categories: environmental physics, object physics, and my personal favorite, character physics. We'll only be talking about character physics today, but I'll go ahead and define all of them just for clarity. Environmental physics, by my definition of course, is any kind of simulated physical reaction in the environment as a result of the player. The most common type of environmental physics is going to be destruction. Anything that really changes the map you're playing on is what I would describe as environmental physics. To demonstrate what I mean right now, let's look at this clip from Battlefield 1. I'd describe object physics as any time the player interacts with an object within the environment, and is able to manipulate it with simulated physics. This goes beyond simply dropping an item or playing a static animation of a crate being moved or something like that. The most obvious and best example of this is the Half-Life 2 pick up the can scene that I showed in the beginning. I don't think it's the first example of this kind of object physics in gaming history, but it's an iconic scene and it was my personal introduction to this kind of physics. The can falls in slightly different ways every time, you're able to throw it back at the guard, and I guess theoretically you could even beat the game with it. I've looked online to see if anybody has done this, but I don't see anything. So, if that sounds interesting, I would be willing to try it. Just let me know. Next up, we've got character physics. This is probably going to be the most common type of physics that you'll see across gaming. I would say that character physics is really just a reference to when a character is killed or defeated, and their body enters a limp state, and then physically reacts to the game world around it. This is commonly known as ragdoll, so that's what I'll be calling it from now on. So now that we've got the introduction and definitions out of the way, I want to get straight into talking about ragdoll. I would say ragdoll is fairly innocuous in most games. It usually doesn't really contribute to the gameplay itself and kind of just serves as a little dopamine treat for the monkey brain after you get a kill. Games like Hitman, Metal Gear Solid, and Assassin's Creed might take ragdoll a little bit farther and have the player hide the body so that they don't get seen, but typically mechanics like that are reserved for the rare stealth game. If ragdoll is so simple though, and doesn't do anything for the gameplay, why is it my favorite? I understand that to a lot of people, destruction and object manipulation sounds a lot cooler than just seeing some guy's body go limp after you shoot or stab him. And I mean, hey, don't get me wrong, blowing up a building or throwing a box is pretty cool. The reason Ragdoll stands out to me in particular is because there's just a certain kind of satisfaction that comes from besting your enemy and watching their body fall victim to good ragdoll physics. I'm gonna be honest, talking about this stuff is gonna make me sound like a sociopath, and I promise I'm not. I think the best place to start when we're just looking at straight up good ragdoll physics has to be Red Dead Redemption 2. I know this game needs no introduction, but I'm gonna do it anyway, just in case. In Red Dead Redemption 2, you play as a Wild West outlaw, and as you can imagine, you're going to be fighting other outlaws and Pinkertons. When Rockstar dropped this game in 2018, people like myself, who really like good ragdoll physics, were blessed with one of the most euphoric, pun intended, experiences in gaming. It was always just so cool to shoot a guy in the shin and watch him stumble around and fall face first in the mud. There's just nothing like it, and the weight of the physics in this game add to the tone. They add to the gravity and the atmosphere. I'm not someone who's always in favor of realism for the sake of realism. I do lean towards fun, and I think this game strikes a good enough balance. I will say, though, there are times when I'm playing games like Red Dead, and shit does start to get a little too real, and I have to just go outside for a little bit. You look at Rockstar's other games, like Grand Theft Auto 4 and my beloved Max Payne 3, and you see the upward trajectory from game to game. GTA 4, then Max Payne. I would kind of argue GTA 5 was lacking in the physics department, but they got back to it with Red Dead 2. And, man, GTA 6 is right around the corner, and I can't even imagine what the physics are going to be like. I think if Rockstar's games and their physics had less weight and less oomph behind it, I honestly don't think they would be the same. I love From Software's games to no end. I've played almost all of them, they're amazing. But, as a ragdoll enthusiast, I've always been kind of bummed out by how floaty the ragdoll is in those games. Also, it's really hot out here, so I'm gonna go back inside. I always do a double take when I kill an enemy that looks like it should weigh like 50 tons, and it dies and goes limp, and I can move it around like it weighs 5 pounds. Though it's not really to my taste, the weightlessness and noodle physics. I guess it does kind of add a silliness to those games that, God knows, is desperately needed sometimes. Another game that I think incorporates ragdoll physics in a pretty unique and innovative way is Squad. It's a minute detail, and to be honest, I don't think most players really interact with it, but it's always stood out to me, so I'm going to talk about it. For the uninitiated, Squad is a milsim game. I always kind of describe it as Battlefield, but if you added a lot of realism, PTSD, and questionable antics.
Get in the vehicle or we run you over.
So whenever you find yourself in a gunfight and a friendly happens to go down, which will happen a lot, they don't immediately die. They're able to be revived. I know that other contemporary shooters have revive mechanics, but I like how Squad does it more because of one tiny little feature. So when a friendly gets shot and their body goes ragdoll, anyone on the team is able to run up and grab them by an arm or a leg or a head. Only one of the heads, though. And while you're holding them, you're able to drag them back into cover to get them revived.
Hello.
I can't tell you how many movie moments I've had in Squad where a buddy goes down, I run through gunfire, I grab their arm, and I drag them back into cover. Man, it is so sick. The intensity is real, and especially with the proximity voice chat, you can talk to your friends. I love it when people start screaming about how they can't feel their leg. It is such a good time. It's also always really silly just watching your friend's ragdoll body drag over rocks and curbs and stuff like that and just kind of flop around. I mean, come on, that's where half of the enjoyment comes from, is just the silliness of ragdoll physics. This feature mechanically works so well too, because in other shooters like Battlefield, you have to run to your friend's dead body, and you can't move them, you just have to stay there and revive them, hoping that you don't get domed from across the map. I can only talk about good ragdoll physics in so many games, because, to be honest, most of them are pretty similar. But the last one I want to look at today honestly has some of the best ragdoll physics I've ever seen. Bodycam is a recently released first-person shooter game that has a heavy emphasis on physics. Made in Unreal Engine by two young devs, one 17 and the other 20, the emphasis on physics goes far beyond just ragdoll and factors heavily into the gameplay as well, which we'll come back to later in this video. I understand that physics are determined by the engine the game is being developed on, but I think barring an intentional stylistic choice, games in the same genre of Bodycam and other similarly realistic or violent games have few excuses for having poor ragdoll. I want to make it clear before we move on and look at some examples of games with bad ragdoll that obviously every game doesn't need it. I feel like this should go without saying, but I'm just gonna say it anyway. Games like RuneScape, Mario, Stardew Valley obviously don't need ragdoll physics. In fact, it would actively detract from the experience and ruin the art styles of these games. I guess the kind of games that I look at that I expect to have good ragdoll physics are ones that kind of go for more realism and more of a focus on combat. There's one game that always comes to mind, and it checks both of those boxes. Ghost of Tsushima is a pretty sick game on many levels. I don't have to tell you this if you've played it. The combat is fast and fluid, the traversal is fun, and honestly, I enjoy the Ubisoft-esque side objectives. When I first played the game though, I was, as you could imagine, pretty bummed out when I realized that the ragdoll kind of sucks. Instead of having typical ragdoll like we've explored previously in this video, Ghost of Tsushima has this weird in-between of ragdoll and static animation. So when you kill an enemy, their limbs will magnetize to the ground. It's a lot like Halo Combat Evolved, if you know what I mean. I would say it looks alright most of the time, but sometimes it just fully bugs out and becomes body horror. It doesn't ruin the whole game for me, but it is kind of immersion breaking when I see a guy levitating or breaking his back just because the physics don't know what to do. I like watching my enemies fall into and off of stuff in a satisfying way, and there were so many times throughout Ghost of Tsushima where there were perfect moments, but the game ends up just blue-balling me and I get static animation after static animation. I look at something like Demon's Souls. It's kind of similar, there's a lot of sword play and really good ragdoll, and I just kind of think, man, if only Ghost of Tsushima had this kind of ragdoll, I would like it a lot more, honestly. I could go on, and I would love to, but this is a video about several things, and I can't just stick to one topic. If you're someone who's interested in ragdoll, I'll put a list up on the screen right now, showing games that have really good ragdoll physics in my opinion. These are just the examples that I could think of, but if anybody else out there has more, please feel free to list them in the comments section. While Ghost of Tsushima and other similar games are pretty innocent examples of bad ragdoll that don't fundamentally harm the gameplay, there are those few games that incorporate physics to a detrimental degree. Exanima is a top-down, dark fantasy RPG. Pretty much everything in the game is physics-based, including your character at all times. This specific kind of ragdoll is known as active ragdoll. You'll see it in other games like Gang Beasts, Party Animals, and Human Fall Flat. Active ragdoll has its own positive and negative effects. As for the games I just mentioned, which I would describe as party games, active ragdoll works well. The fun and colorful characters and overall lighter tone make it a little harder to get annoyed when the ragdoll gets in the way. In Exanima's case, the active ragdoll has as many really sick moments as it does infuriating ones. I understand it's part of the realistic aesthetic and it does fit the tone well, but it can definitely feel a little bullshit sometimes. Because of the more hardcore gameplay and punishment for dying, it's a real bitch when the active ragdoll gets you killed. It's definitely a skill issue on my part, but I personally just find it too frustrating to even want to try and get good at it. I said we'd come back to Bodycam, and if you've played it, you know why. Bodycam also has active ragdoll, and has the same pitfalls as Exanima. You see videos of Bodycam, and yeah, the active ragdoll makes it look real, and it fits the aesthetic well. If you send a clip to Grandma, she'll definitely believe it's the Ukraine war or something, but is it really fun? The devs have undoubtedly done something unique, and that deserves praise. But again, I think it being real for the sake of realness just makes it less enjoyable. Like I said earlier, I want my games to be fun, and Bodycam was fun for about an hour. After that hour, the allure of the punchy sound design and realistic graphics wore off quickly. What I was then left with was the game itself, and I wasn't enjoying it. I'm sure you've noticed that all of the clips I'm showing of Bodycam aren't my own, and that's because I ended up refunding it after about an hour and a half. I don't think Bodycam is hopeless though, actually far from it. I'd say maybe just tone down the disorienting active physics and generally add other stuff to make the game more gamey? At the time of writing, Bodycam hasn't even been in early access for a month. And because of that, I want to make it clear that I realize this game is still very far from finished. There's plenty of time to improve, but I wanted to talk about it because it's a recent and relevant example of ragdoll physics hurting the gameplay. I wanted to bring it back outside for the outro. I think I've about said everything I wanted to for today. If I go on any longer, this video will derail and become about Max Payne 3, which almost happened several times during recording, but I'll save that for another day. To wrap it up, I think some games should have good ragdoll, while others shouldn't, but that's just what I like. Play whatever you think is fun, and don't let your enjoyment of games hinge on other people's opinions. If there's one thing I'd want you to take away from this video, it's this. Preference is important, and everyone's is different. Farewell, everyone.